How involved is that? How involved is that? Ladies and gentlemen, vanity has struck again. But that's not the only way to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Between the Sharks. I got some new parts in the mail, and number one dog is here to keep me company. So we're already off to a pretty good start. So the goal for this phase of everything is to get this wheel and this wheel tied to each other with a tie rod, and then get that system tied into our steering box and get our steering box mounted to the frame. So the front portion of the steering is what needs to happen. I've already done some work on the column, and eventually we'll connect the two. All right, today's adventure may be a little academic, which will be helpful for you guys that are out there trying to set up your steering, but don't worry, for those of you here for entertainment, I am guaranteed to screw enough stuff up and hurt myself that you might want to stick around. But we have to go through, well, I'm gonna go through all the parts of this system and all of the options, because I think I know the best way to solve this one, but you know, we ought to cross off the other options as not quite as good as the one in my head. I'm kind of getting blinded here, but you know, I'm trying to shed some light on the subject. So let's go through the parts and pieces so that we're all on the same page with the correct terms, right? From the steering box out, we have a steering box, pitman arm. The pitman arm connects to the drag link. The drag link runs out to the steering arm. Also connected to the steering arm, we have a tie rod that runs across to the other wheel, tying both wheels together. Ideally, what needs to happen for the system to work in its geometrically best kind of thing is, height-wise, this and this need to be level, flat, and this drag link and this tie rod need to be parallel, all right? That's kind of the deal. All right, so as you can see here, tie rod ends are indeed tapered. Forwards are 7-degree tapers. It matters for old hot rod stuff that you're building out of Ford parts. You can see because of the notch in the nut, this is started left hand, this is started right hand, so that when we spin this tube, it will either extend or contract, right? So instead of one unthreading while one threads in, this sort of functions both ways. You're either tightening or loosening both sides at once by turning the tube in one direction. So that's how you set your adjustments and, you know, your alignment with your tie rod. 7-degree taper, like we talked about. These steering arms are tapered from the bottom up. So it wants to go in like that. But, ladies and gentlemen, vanity has struck again in the land of hot rodding. So what that means is we put a dropped axle in so that we could look cool and lower the car. So we split the wishbones to accommodate that. And now you can see that quite clearly we're in our own darn way, which is common. That's why everybody bends the steering arms. So the most common way found to deal with this split wishbone dropped axle problem is to take out an acetylene torch, heat this guy right here, bend it down, and then heat it right here and bend this area flat, which gets you something that looks like this, this is an aftermarket drop steering arm. I have a set of spindles that don't have steering arms. They're aftermarket, so you have to put a steering arm on there. So I ordered a dropped steering arm. And you can kind of get it close, but basically, you know, it would put it just like that, so that you can put your tie rods in from the bottom and you are clear of the wishbones. But that's not the only way to do it. But we got another option here. This is a 7-degree reamer. So in theory, what I could do is just ream out half of this eyelet from the top. Then I would be able to put my tie rod ends in from the top and they would still fit and be happy. Now, I understand there's going to be some debate on the internet about everything. I have more than enough faith that that is more than enough contact and more than enough secure, because in addition to everything, right, to keep it from being sloppy, A, we pulled in and sort of cinched down because of the taper, and then there's a castle nut, and then you put a cotter pin on this. So I think it's completely safe. In fact, so do most steering parts manufacturers. This brand new pitman arm came tapered on both sides so that you can put the thing in the top or the bottom, which I thought was pretty interesting. So if you don't want to do it that way, don't do it that way. I think it's fine. So it's definitely an option on our table. Before we go crazy with it though, we should talk about the difference between a cross steer application and a push-pull steering application when you're dropping your steering arms. Now, if you drop your steering arms and you're only running a tie rod just below your wishbones, then that's pretty easy geometry to get right. It becomes a little bit more difficult if you're gonna run cross steer. In that situation, you see, if your steering box is a Corvair style or F1 style, and it's swinging here and pushing and pulling this way, and it's going to go to a steering arm on the driver's side, well, that's fine. You know, your tie rod running under your wishbones will always sort of stay in the orientation of the wheels. You know, it'll go like this, but because of the steering arm, it will never go up and down. It's a little different with a cross steer steering setup because we've got to set the height of the steering box, and if I jam this thing in here and I tuck this under the wishbone, as this wheel raises and lowers, the tie rod will be going with the wishbone, but it'll be changing this angle quite a bit. Now, for the most part, whether you go above or below your wishbones, the tie rod that is attached to the steering arm on the wheel is going to travel pretty much with the wishbone. And I say pretty much because we did split these things and they are mounted independently. So it's not working as a whole system, meaning if this wheel goes up and that wheel goes in a hole, there's going to be enough twist that the relationship where the tie rod passes over or under will change just a fuzz, like just a little bit. Little brown dog, come on. Now, we can run above our wishbones like so if we want to. The only thing is, obviously, the wishbone and our axle and our wheels are going to move independently of our frames. So we need suspension travel above the tie rod to the frame in the amount of the maximum suspension travel. What the hell was that? To me, that is probably around, oh, I don't know, like this height is what I would use, because clearly if this spring gets mashed into the frame, we're in a world of trouble. But I'd rather the spring hit the frame before the steering components do, because when this bends, it will change the relationship. Your steering will go cross-eyed and you'll crash into a tree. The thing is, right now, I don't know exactly what the height will be until I cinch this tie rod down, which means I would need to ream it first, then pull it tight, and then see where it actually sits. Now, the problem with doing that for something like mock-up phase is all of these things, tie rods, you have to pound back out with a tie rod removing tool. Even the pitman arm, to get where this height really lives on this box so that we can mount the box at the right height, you have to tighten the pitman arm down, which will cinch it on there, which needs to be pulled off with a puller. Again, these are not major problems, but it makes mocking up, like, you know, you don't want to start taking the hammer to brand new parts. You know what I'm saying? So I have another method here to kind of guess the relationship of the tie rod itself to the tie rod ends once they're seated. I happen to have a spare front end. I think it's a 37. I don't even remember. Round spindles. So yeah, it's earlier, but whatever. The point is, I can measure on the old Fords what the distance is, factorially speaking. For safety, I'm going to call that an 1.5 inch drop down off of the steering arm on a factory Ford setup. It has a very crusty old rubber boot on there, but basically that's the number I'm looking for. Which means I think I can safely say an 1.5 inch above or below the steering arm once the thing is tightened down properly. So now we can take that measurement and apply it. All right, so using what we just learned, if I ream this thing out and then we cinch it down, The taper ends about a ½ inch up. So we're at 2 inches now, meaning this unit and this relationship would drop down 1/2 inch, which would give us 2 inches of suspension travel before we clobbered the frame. That does not seem like enough, especially when we have what will turn out to be about 1.5 inches to come down to our wishbone. So that's something that we need to think about, because we could bend and lower this steering arm enough to do the tie rods on the top, or we could bend it way down enough to do the tie rods from the bottom. I'm gonna math this out. I'm gonna see. I wonder if it's the same difference. All right, so I'm trying to figure out how much the steering arms need to drop if I come in from the top. Now, I am using the back hole right now with the tie rod, but the reason I'm doing that is the wishbone runs uphill. So the further back, the less clearance I'm gonna have here. So I don't wanna get a measurement here and then suddenly lower it too much and hit this thing. It looks like if it came down about 1 inch, also this hole seems like it's been tapered sometime in its, nearly 100-year history from the top as well, because of the way this is seating in here. I'll try to remember to show you the difference, but I probably won't. But just trust me, like that's pretty close to seated. There should be about a ½ inch gap, and there's a 1/16 over, and it's not tightened down yet. I'll check it with a micrometer, but I'm pretty sure that's what we're dealing with on the back side here. That's a lot of words just to tell you that I'm checking my bases. Is that a thing? Anyway, yeah, no, pitchers do that, right? Okay, so I think I can bring this down about 1 inch here, and then still have a little bit of room for when this wishbone moves independently of, say, like the steering arm on this side of the frame, because this hits a pothole or something, or a speed bump or a curb, or anything could happen. Now I'm going to check the measurements for the bottom side to see how far I'd have to drop it if I wanted to run everything underneath. I know that's traditional, but I don't love it. Just don't. That's low, man. It's low, and it's toward the back side of the tire, right? The center of the tire is gonna go over a bump with everything with the center of the tire. That starts to get, road hazardy, in my opinion. So if I have enough clearance here and here, that's how I'm gonna run it on this particular car. So now I'm just kind of holding it up, but you can see it against the wishbone there. It's against the wishbone on that side. We'd have to come down with the steering arm right around 2.5 inches, which is probably pretty close to what this drop is, if not a fuzz more. I can measure that too, actually. Don't fall over. It's about a 3-inch drop off the bolts, but again, that's relative to this bolt, which is 1 inch and change. Anyway, it's probably pretty similar. This is not by any means new ground to break. So this is probably modeled off of what has become common. Now, granted, the way that you do your wishbones and the type of wishbones that you use will affect this and all of that, but again, you'll figure that out as you go in your particular situation, because you really do have to get to this point and then figure it out from here. So my guts are, because that would help keep the steering box up, to go in over the top of the wishbone and then come back out over the top of the wishbone for the tie rod. All right, on the drag link, we're just kind of jammed in there, but we're not quite parallel. We're running downhill a little bit, but if the steering arm comes down and the pitman arm goes up, then that should even out. In addition, we can raise this steering box maybe by about 3/4 inch before we get into trouble here, and we could probably lower it. It's just a matter of building brackets at that point. So we do have some flexibility there. So I think the conclusion I'm coming to is I need to ream out the top of the steering arms and drop them down 1 inch. I'm gonna review everything for a second before I break out the big fat torch and try to do that whole thing. Also, if you're at home and you don't want to deal with this and getting an oxyacetylene set up and all that stuff, either get aftermarket spindles, or I'm 98.623% sure you can just cut that steering arm off, bolt you on some of these Jimmy Jams, blot out, and you're just done. There's one other option, and that other option is that I pull these spindles off with the brake brackets and all of that and swap them out for the spindles that are on the Mercury right now that have no steering arms, because I have a dropped axle for it, so I may run into the same problem, but it's a different wishbone setup and everything else. Let me show you. See, those 4678 wishbones have that kick up right there. So it might be a little more conducive to the existing steering arms if we have to split those wishbones. I'm gonna try not to, but am I gonna be better off with stock steering arms on this thing? How involved is that? How involved is that? Now I've got myself in a pickle, gang, because I think it's about equal amounts of work, right? To replace the spindles is a matter of just taking the wheels off, pulling the caliper back, pulling the caliper bracket off, popping the kingpin out. Spindle comes off, the whole brake and bearing assembly will come right out. Swapping that onto the other car, taking those spindles off that are already set up for the same disc brakes, I think, because they're Speedway spindles, popping those things on and just bolting the steering arms on. I guess that's the thing, right? What I'm looking at now is preservation of parts, because these are 4670. In fact, they're off the Mercury, those spindles specifically. So, because originally I was going to run the Mercury front brakes and all that stuff, backing plates, and then the more I thought about it, those brakes just suck. But now I'm saying if those spindles and steering arms will work for the Mercury, in fact, if I throw them back on there, I can put the stock tie rods and everything else back in, and I can steer that car a little bit and move it around a little better. And if I ever finish this car, which is, you know, seeming impossible at this point, but if I ever did, the Mercury is next. So, am I better off all project-wise just swapping these spindles and using these bolt-on steering arms that appear like they're going to work just fine for this setup, and preserving these spindles unreamed, unbent for that setup in case I don't have to do a split wishbone situation to get that car low? The same amount of work, I think. It's different work. It feels like a big decision. After many cogitations and a ton of measuring, these particular steering arms will not drop enough to work in this particular situation the way I have these wishbones mounted. So, in addition, it would create kind of an issue with the cross steer. It'd be more forgiving if it was just the tie rod and we were using an F1 or Corvair style box to the driver's side. I know I keep saying that, it's broken record stuff, but everybody's hot rods are different. So I don't want to tell you something won't work, because clearly you change one part, it may fundamentally change everything for better or worse. So I think that brings us back to plan A, which is ream the top of these, set everything in there, and then see how it fits. And if we need to come down with the steering arms to the top of the wishbones, then that's what we're gonna do. All right, for those of you guys screaming at your television screens right now, I heard you. I heard you. Like, what if we didn't ream out the top, but we just bent it up? Because clearly we might not have to bend it as far. Or at least we wouldn't have to ream it all out, or whatever. Because, you know, it's the same but different, less reaming, that type of deal. Which one less step is usually a good step. It's one less thing in theory to screw up. So if we just bent the steering arms up a fuzz, we might be all right. However, I just realized if I bend them up, this bolt will never come out, which is critical to removing the caliper for replacing the caliper, but also the brake pads. So in this particular application, up is not the right answer. We're back to moving them down and reaming the top. Hot rodding, guys, dang it. We're learning more and more here. I gotta build a jack plate eventually because I can't jack up the wheels right now with it on the lift. And the ones that they sell seem ridiculously expensive and bulky, and I'm not into that because I most of the time will want it out of the way. But right now, it'd be super convenient to be able to jack this thing up. But I will show you what we've got going on. Here is the 7-degree tapered reamer. If I slide it in here, you can see that this one has, for sure, been reamed out. So we don't have to mess with that one. This one, on the other hand, does need to get dealt with, and you can see here, it's actually kind of rubbing against the caliper. So I do want this to go in straight. I'm definitely having a similar situation over here. So I've got to drop this thing down, take the wheels off, and all I've got to do is pull these pins and slide the calipers out. That's no big deal. It's basically how you change the brake pads anyway. And obviously, if I'm pulling out the acetylene torch for this steering arm, yes, technically you can do it with the tires on there, but these things are so expensive, and I don't want a tire fire in the garage. Let's play our favorite game, Dumb or Brilliant. All right, so we got this all pulled apart. It's not a big deal. Tire came off, caliper came off. That's really as far as we got. So I pulled out this, don't be afraid. I know, it's, you know, it's caliper, but it's Harbor Freight. So spend your $7 and get a free flashlight and bring your 20% off coupon and grab one. It's a good, you know, obviously reference tool. I wouldn't use it on spaceships. I don't think NASA uses these, but we also have a tool, you know, more like what the Egyptians would use. So what we're doing here is, obviously this is a long reamer and it tapers. This is far larger than our tie rod end, so we don't want to go too far. So in order to get the depth, we're going to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to go into what I believe is a stock position here, right? And then, stay. So I'm going to jam this guy into what I believe to be a stock tie rod hole. And just, you know, make a mark. Should go that deep. Let's see how they did. Not bad. In fact, it looks like they went a little further on this one. Sure, I get it, fine. I mic'd the brand new tie rod end, and so the thickest part is 61 thousandths. These mic'd out around 60 thousandths, so that's kind of what we're going for. Obviously, also, I'm not gonna just bury this thing into the tape. We're gonna go a little bit at a time and test fit the tie rod. We want it to seat right at the top of the shoulder. Basically, it tapers to this point, and then it stays kind of, you know, even. All right, a couple methods. The impact driver and a 3/8 12-point socket seem to be the best. I'm pretty happy with it. You can, I don't know if you guys can see in there, but sometimes things show up better than you think. It's just about halfway down, so I guess that tracks-ish. Our tie rods are tie rodded. We can't really steer it too well because I also connected the drag link. So a quick thing about this reamer, I bought it off eBay. American company claims to have made it in the USA. It feels like a quality tool. It still has plenty of edge on it. The thing I didn't recognize when I purchased it though, is I've seen many reamers out there. This reminds me of sort of like a bushing reamer, but I've seen some that look more like an end mill or like a little bit like a drill, and obviously that would kind of help pull it down. Ultimately, I did it with the impact because it was easy to control the speed and the pressure, but I did have to obviously supply all the pressure because there was nothing drawing it in. So I don't know, maybe there's a better style of reamer for this type of job if you find yourself in a position where you have to do it. So getting ready to bend these steering arms, there's a couple things that you're gonna wanna do ahead of time. First of all, you're gonna need a lever, pipe wrench, something. This is a heavy gauge 1x2 piece of steel. I can fit it over there. I can push down on this. That will help me do the bendy. Now, this is going to require 2 bends, and most likely your bending of steering arms will take 2 bends as well, no matter what you're doing. The first bend happens right up here, and that's where you bend it up or down, and then the next bend happens right behind the tie rod. In this case, there's a spot for 2 tie rod ends here. One goes to the drag link, obviously. We've been talking about this the whole time, but the second bend is to bend these 2 holes back to being level or pretty close to level. To get my starting point for my measurements, because you can take the spindles off and do this on the bench, but you need something to hold them really tight and all of that. But I'm gonna measure from just the backside of this tie rod, hole mounting position, whatever, to my lift. And I'm gonna drop this 1.25 inches, and then I'm gonna bend this back up at this point right here. So on both sides, I don't even need it to be on a level spot. I just need to remember that I'm going to measure from right here down, drop it 1.25 inches, and then just straighten that back out. That's all we're really doing here. Before we light up the acetylene torch and try to bend these steering arms, we gotta have a quick bit of real talk. I take this stuff extremely seriously. You see, in our shops, we all have a collection of tools that can do irreparable, massive damage to our bodies nearly instantly. Depending on what you do, those tools are all different, but we all have those tools. The oxyacetylene setup, however, is the only one that I can think of that can blow you to smithereens. Now that gives it a very unique, deadly property, and that is simply that it's the only tool that I can think of that while using it, I can harm the person across the shop from me. Not only next to me, but like many feet away from me. Learn from someone that really knows what they're doing. It's a tool that you can learn to use quite safely. Now, if you are ever around someone who thinks it's cute to fill rubber gloves or plastic bags with acetylene and blow them up, you have it on good authority from me that the appropriate action is to go turn the tanks off, kick them square in the nuts, take the torch out of their hands, put it away, and tell them to grow up. I'm gonna heat it up right about here, and I'm gonna try to bend it down. I've taken my measurements with things mocked up, so at this point, right now, I'm at 13 inches to the top of the steering arm, just behind the tie rod connection point. Doesn't matter what that number is, I just know I want to come down about 1.25 inches. I've got a wet rag that I can maybe hopefully use as a heat sink on the top of this spindle. I have my lever, fire extinguisher standing by. a bit. I don't know. Now we're on it. Maybe a little over it. It's pretty good. This out now. Right. As with all things, this is easier with a little buddy because, you know, you're gonna have somebody measuring and bending while somebody else just mans the torch and manages the heat. But it's obviously doable with one person. The story stick was definitely super helpful. Put my heatsink back on this thing just because I'm not trying to rapidly cool it, but I'm just trying to take the heat out of the spindle. I never replaced the bushings in here anyway, so we'll see. If they need to be replaced, they need to be replaced. And if I cheesed them, well, I cheesed them. So gonna do this on the other side and we'll take a look, see if everything fits. Man, that is hot. So right now we're looking at right around 3 inches of clearance from the frame to the tie rod. I'd love to get a little bit more, but I don't necessarily know that we need it. Basically, I gotta get the car put together, we'll balance on the suspension, and if it becomes a problem, we can either gain a fuzz more by lowering it closer to the wishbone, but because, just remember, because the wishbones aren't attached anymore, they're not a wishbone, they're split wishbones, the wheel and the wishbone don't exactly move together. Like the left hand, like the passenger side moves with the passenger side and the driver's side moves with the driver's side. But what I'm saying is if one wheel goes up and one wheel goes down, they're gonna do this kind of a number. So I do want a little bit of a clearance so that the tie rod doesn't hit the wishbones. All right, so for us, we bent the steering arms down 1.25 inches, and that became pretty tight to the top of what I believe are Model A wishbones. I got them with something, so here they are on the car. But again, that's not really a metric for anyone else out there, unless you have the same kind of, wishbone mounting thing and the same angle and the same drop axle and all that stuff. Just the important thing is, do the thing that I do. Just be the suspension. Do the suspension dance and figure out how things are going to move, and then make sure you have enough clearance, or maximize the clearance that you can get. It's a hot rod. It's a little car. A lot of things are going to be fighting for space. Every time you reduce the footprint of that car, whether it's lowering it or channeling it or chopping it or whatever, the amount of space you have to work with decreases, and then you got to get more and more clever and use every fraction of an inch you possibly can to get all of the parts and pieces and mechanisms in there. Because really, what we're all doing here is some version of like lowering a car and making it smaller while we jam a bigger engine and everything else in it. So every little inch counts. So I'm gonna call this a pretty big success and a pretty big step forward. I was hoping to get the steering box mounted in this video, but it's just not gonna happen. Instead, I am going to claim this victory, clean up, put everything back together, and we'll start fresh on the steering box. The good news is all you gotta do is just subscribe and just keep watching, and we'll do the steering box next, because, well, it makes sense to do it once this is sort of relatively worked out. You do have to have it mocked up to get this far though. So good luck on your projects out there. We will see you next time on Between the Sharks. Keep marching forward. Time for me to clean up this mess.